Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I have the pleasure to be discussing with you the part of the brain known as the cerebellum. That's right, the cerebellum is maybe one of the more conspicuous regions of the brain. It's sort of considered a little mini brain, and it's located, as you can see, anterior and posterior to the cerebrum, which is up above here, and it's also posterior to the brainstem. So cerebellum, and it's involved in coordinated movement. And I'm glad you're able to join me in this conversation. I hope to have some fun kicking around the anatomy and physiology. Pun intended, coordinated movement. And so let's talk a little bit about this. So if you were to take a look at the brain, in other words, an anterior view, take a section here, you may not notice the cerebrum uh, too clearly because in fact it's posterior. As you can see here, you just notice the lobes over on both sides here behind the brainstem. But if you were to look posterior, in other words, you would be looking at the left and right hemispheres of the cerebrum up here, but the cerebellum also has a left and right hemisphere. You can see it very clearly. Okay, the cerebellum is again one of the most identifiable parts of the brain due to its unique shape over here. You can see it in its location. Uh, if you look here at the cerebrum up here, and if you were to pull the cerebellum down, you'll notice that there's this big fissure here known as the transverse fissure. And then you can get a better look at the cerebellum right there. And there's the brainstem. So this is looking down or dorsal view at the transverse fissure right there. Okay. And again, just to sort of point this out, if you were to pull down, as I was saying, on the cerebellum, you'll notice that the cerebrum is up above here, and you'll notice here's a look at the midbrain, if you will, if you're familiar with the fact that these are the superior and inferior colliculi, or colliculus for singular. And then you may even notice over here, here's the pineal gland located right underneath, as right there. But today's conversation is going to be about the cerebellum. And it's very important because it helps us to perform everyday sort of voluntary tasks like walking and writing and texting and playing musical instruments. And it helps to coordinate that movement. Now, I could say that, coordinate movement, but to me, that would be ambiguous until someone, or if I read something to further clarify that. And so hopefully this video is going to do that. I mean, it's going to be a strong attempt at that. So again, here's the dorsal view of looking down at the transverse fissure. And you can see here's the cerebellum right there, and there's the brainstem. Okay, so there we are. Now, it's also important in terms of functionality, helping us to stay balanced, and it helps us to stay upright. And patients who have damage to their cerebellums, that's one of the ways in which we determine actual normal functionality is when there is injury to a particular region of the brain, then we can see where the patient's struggling. And so when a person's having trouble keeping their balance or maintaining muscle coordination, we know that there may be some trauma to the cerebellum. Okay, and so just to list some of the functions here right out of the gate, it helps to adjust postural muscles in order to help maintain posture. It helps to fine-tune conscious and subconscious movements by coordinating and relating muscle activity and regulating it, I should say. And so it refines sort of these learned movements a little bit, like riding a bike or playing piano. So that's pretty cool, but getting into how it does that is, I think, even more interesting. So it works by coordinating movements. And so what I want to say with that is that it helps to smooth out the movement and to make it a little bit more accurate. So that must mean that there's communication and feedback to the muscles themselves. And so pretty fascinating. So again, another example of what I'm talking about. So if you're trying to do some sort of fine motor skill, like for example, texting is a good example of that. Sometimes just that coordinated, tapping on the screen is somewhat tricky if you think about it neurologically, and it's going to involve, no doubt, it's going to involve the cerebellum. And so let's talk about that. So first off, I would need to start off in the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is this upper area of the forebrain, and it's divided by this central sulcus right in here. Of course, it's easy to see it in this diagram, this red line right here. And then to the front is the frontal lobe right over here, and then here's the parietal lobe of the cerebrum. But what I wanted to point out is that just in front, in this area right in here, there's a motor area of the cortex involved in conscious motor or muscle movement. And then posterior to the central sulcus, there's an area where the cerebrum makes sense of, or in other words, it figures out sensory information. Okay, so this conversation is going to be about motor movement. And so let's take a look here. And again, here's the front over on this side. Here's posterior over here. So here's the central sulcus. And so in this pre-central sulcus area right in here, precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe, that is where in the cerebrum is where you actually have voluntary direction of movement. In other words, the decision making of to move your arm or to kick a ball or to move a finger. Okay, so this is known as the primary motor cortex region, right up in this area, right in here. Okay, right where I'm pointing with the cursor. So precentral gyrus. Okay, now this is what I'm going to simply refer to as a motor plan, a decision to move a particular muscle. And so what happens is, as I mentioned, that occurs up here in the upper part of the brain. But the cerebellum, which is in the lower part towards posterior, gets that information about the plan. And so the motor plan involves which muscles that need to contract in order to do the task. What is the intensity? Should I go easy? Should I go hard? And for how long? Duration. So basically the plan is to move. And so the cerebellum's going to get that information, and this is how it's going to work. So the motor neuron up here, as I was mentioning before, the decision to move, travels down axons. As you can see here, it's traveling down the cerebrum, and it enters into the brain stem, and then ultimately these upper motor neurons are going to connect down here in the spinal cord to lower motor neurons, and that's going to send information out, like for example down your arm in order to contract an arm muscle. And so they send messages, say to the arm, and to make the arm move in a particular direction. So the arm moves. Okay, so there you have it. But what's then happening while that's going on, while that nerve impulse is causing the arm to move, check this out. There's also nerve impulses that are traveling down and that are reaching the cerebellum simultaneously. So do you see here in purple, it's going and it's communicating with the cerebellum. Now, what's that all about? Well, the cerebellum needs to know what the plan is. So now that the cerebellum is aware of the plan, and it needs to know actually what's going on. Okay, so it's time to move the arm. But then what happens is, and this doesn't necessarily have to involve too much detail. I'm going to keep it a little bit simple. So there's stretch receptors inside the muscle fibers. And what happens there is that those will send nerve impulses back to the central nervous system, back to the spinal cord. And what's happening here is that the cerebellum is then going to receive information about position sense. So it's going to receive information about what's going on with that movement, although this is unconscious. And so we're not aware of it. It's not reaching consciousness. So this information is going back to the cerebellum, and it's like we're getting information about how that position is occurring. And so after comparing, if you will, the actual movement to the position sense, in other words, like sort of figuring out how's that motor plan going, corrections might be needed to be made to make the operation smoother or more accurate. And I will add that it's often the case where there's corrections that do need to occur. And so if there's corrections that need to occur, in other words, adjustments and coordinated movement. So this is what I was saying at the top of the video. So this is what happens is that the cerebellum needs to send feedback. Okay, and that's going to be shown here in green a little bit. So the green is going to be sending nerve impulses back up into this motor cortex area right here, and that's going to cause new nerve impulses to come down. And so this process happens all over again, but it's an adjustment. It's fine tuning, like your balance or adjustment in terms of motor coordination. So it's pretty cool. It gets involved in fine tuning coordination. So that's a lot of the physiology, but the anatomy of it is also very interesting. And I want to point out a few things. So when you look at a section here of the cerebellum, it looks, and again, this is like early anatomists when they first looked at this sort of thought, this looks a lot like trees and leaves and branching out right here. And so this structure up here is known as the folia or leaves, the surface of the cerebellum. It's highly folded and convoluted. And so it's gray matter. So all of this upper cortex, meaning toward the outside, is gray, meaning that there's a lot of soma and neurons located in that particular area. Whereas in the center is more white matter, right in here, which are more myelinated axons, if you will. I should point out that the cerebellum also has lobes. It has an anterior lobe, shown here in blue, and it has a posterior lobe right over here. Okay, and there's also hemispheres that are separated, both the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, by a midline called the vermis. So as you can see right in here, the vermis. So here's a posterior view of the cerebellum. So there's an anterior lobe, a posterior lobe, and left and right hemispheres as well. Okay, and again, not getting too detailed with this, is that the vermis tends to be involved in coordinating movements that are sort of medial, in other words, in the midline of the body. Like for example, in the legs, the medial area of the legs having to do with walking, for example, right in this particular area. And I should also point out that inside the cerebellum, it helps to coordinate not just the arms that I was referring to before, but all kinds of movements. Like for example, in speech, just the simple act, or not simple per se, there's many muscles involved in articulation. It's moving lips, it's moving your tongue around, it's altering your throat in order to properly speak and to enunciate. And it's kind of funny because when I think about that, I sometimes, those of you who are familiar with some of my videos, I have sometimes difficulty enunciating pronouncing different words, and my speech is kind of goofy. And it's also kind of related to, I have to throw myself out there and say that I'm slightly uncoordinated when it comes to motor activity, running around and things like that. Although I make up for and compensate by determination and desire. Just want to point that out as well. So the vermis is separating the hemispheres right in here. And then down below, as you can see in green, there's an additional lobe that we're dealing with down here. Tough word to pronounce. Speaking of difficulty in speaking, is flocculonodular lobe down in here. Right, and this is a superior aspect of the cerebellum. And so when you look inside the cerebellum right here, again, I was mentioning sort of the folia or the leaves, but it was also referred to as the arbor vitae, in other words, tree of life, the highly branched white matter that makes up the cerebellum. So that's kind of cool. So it's the tree of life, and then you have your folia over here. And so what this does is that it relays information. The arborvitae does. It relays information to the Purkinje cells. Now the Purkinje cells, pretty cool. Now you can't see the Purkinje cells, maybe obviously, because this is again, naked eye right here. This is the gross mid-sagittal cut of the brain. But with the microscope, you can look on a cellular level. So if you're looking up here, at the cortex, in other words, the gray area under the microscope, you'll notice here that the blue arrows pointing to these little structures right here, which is the soma of a special type of cell called a Purkinje cell, named after Purkinje. And so let's take a look under higher magnification right there. Can you see here's the soma and nucleus of a Purkinje cell. Now, what's really cool about a Purkinje cell, and there's a lot, I have to hold myself back on this, is that some of the earliest drawings were done by a fabulous Spanish anatomist known as Santiago Ramon y Cajal. And he was using a really cool staining technique. And look at these incredible diagrams. Here's the soma, and look at the dendrites right in here. So an amazing, and this is a beautiful modern picture right here. It really does look like a tree, these Purkinje cells. And so all this branching out means that you can receive all kinds of information. And so it's receiving, these Purkinje cells inside the cerebellum are receiving, ready for this, 200,000 synapses. That's remarkable to me. There's beauty in that, and there really is. And so, what are the Purkinje cells doing? There's a little bit of a complexity to it, but I'll throw it out there anyway. Is that these particular cells, when they're stimulated, nerve impulses come down their axons, and then they release chemicals in the form of neurotransmitters called GABA. And what the GABA does is it's an inhibitory kind of neurotransmitter. And so what it does is it reduces neural activity. And what that does is help to regulate motor movements. Sometimes in coordinated movement, it's not all go, it's slow down and stop. And so it helps to regulate and coordinate motor movement. And so a couple of maybe not as interesting, I shouldn't say that, but important structural areas of the cerebellum are these peduncles, which carry tracks of neurons that connect the cerebellum to other portions of the brain, fairly significant, to the brain stem, the cerebrum, I should say, and spinal cord. And they're sort of broken up into three sections: superior, middle, and inferior peduncles. You can see they're superior, inferior, and middle cerebellar peduncles. And so staggering to the end. And so I was mentioning before at the top of the video, one of the ways in which we are familiar with the functions of an organ or an area of the brain is when something happens. So sadly, sometimes patients will experience trauma, in other words, injury to the cerebellum, or maybe even a stroke. In other words, a blockage of blood to that particular area, or maybe there's a tumor in that area, and that results in uncoordinated sort of staggering known as ataxia. And the ataxia is also can be brought on not just from severe damage, but temporary ataxia can be brought on by intoxication, in other words, alcohol. And that causes a person to stagger, characteristic of that, and it disturbs muscle coordination. All right, and so hopefully you enjoyed this brief conversation of the cerebellum. Thank you for watching.